During the reign of Uther Pendragon, in the wake of the dragon-shaped star, Merlin foretold the coming of Arthur, a great warrior king who would defend his country and faith from foreign invaders and natural disasters. From the old Roman order that had withered and died, Arthur would sow the seeds of a nation that was to become Great Britain. Today Arthur's name lives on, but did he ever really exist? Alan Wilson and Baram Blackett have gone further than any other researchers in establishing the facts behind the legend. Since 1977, they have been re-evaluating the most ancient British texts. Some of their astonishing findings have been published, but it is only now that the full story can be told. Not only have they identified two Arthurs, but they've also found physical evidence to support their claims. Their research shows a long-crafted conspiracy to rewrite our history and deny our true heritage. The book that really brought Arthur to the attention of the world was The History of the Kings of Britain, written in 1135 by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Arthur's name had been recorded before, but it was this work that portrayed him as a knightly king, chivalrous in all his deeds.
The problem immediately was that he proclaimed an Arthur who fought the Romans, and an Arthur who fought and defeated the Saxons and others. The immediate problem is that you have a 200 and maybe 25 or 250-year-old king. This was pointed out by Polydore Virgil, the historian for Henry VIII of the Six Wives, and said that it is impossible that you've got a 250-year-old king here. He can't fight the Romans and the Saxons. In the usual negative stance which is taken towards Welsh history and to most ancient British history, this is immediately used to say all this history is false. But the obvious answer is that there are two King Arthurs. And there are two. And the man who fought the Romans did so in 383 to 88, and is very clearly recorded, and very well recorded, authenticated. And the man who fought the Saxons in the 6th century is a 6th generation direct descendant in the male line, and he is Arthur II. So you do have two kings, 200 years apart, both of them warrior kings. One fights the Romans, one fights the Saxons.
With a great conqueror and defender rolled into one mighty king, their fame lived on within the Arthur legend. Today, a mystery surrounds the real Arthurs, but that was not always the case. In the Brutes of England, written between the 10th and 15th century, Arthur is clearly recorded.
So the Brutes of England actually commence with the invasion of Albine from Syria, which is actually datable to about 1600 BC. And they roll on through the centuries, and as they come on, they become more and more detailed. Now, King Arthur is given quite a significant place in these histories. He gets quite a lot of space. And the coverage is again melding together or welding together King Arthur I and King Arthur II. Now, if we look at King Arthur II, we'll find there's a very interesting reference to him in the Brutes of England. And we've got to remember that up until modern times, this would have been generally firmly believed as authentic history. So in chapter 79, it's telling how King Arthur is over in France, Brittany area. And it's all about the Easter time. And it says, "And when Arthur had thus his knights feasted at April after next sowing," sowing being springtime, "he came again into Britain, his own land. And after at Whitsuntide next sowing, by counsel of his barons, he would be crowned King of Glamorgan." So everybody in Britain, certainly England and Wales, would have been in no doubt whatsoever from the roots of England, that King Arthur II, at least, was a king of Glamorgan and Gwent, certainly king of Glamorgan. There can be no doubt about this. It's a very clear statement.
Another historian called Percy Enderby, writing for Charles II, made no secret of there being a real King Arthur.
His history really commences with the Brutus story of the great Brutus migration and moving into Britain, which is as routinely dismissed as is the Albine invasion, although there's a great deal of physical evidence extant today to prove that both are true. And so what is happening is that you have a history which was recognizable to everybody as British history, certainly up until 1700. And then suddenly things begin to change and move. By 1850 they were writing histories of Britain that bear no resemblance whatsoever in the early stages, no resemblance whatsoever to the previous histories of Britain. Out go Albine, out go Brutus, out go this, out goes everything. And you have a brand new history. It's like George Orwell, 1714 and not 1984. It's an Orwellian maneuver, and they are restyling, rewriting, reinventing a history for political and religious correctness. And that's what's happened. They've rewritten the histories. What they didn't want, they simply derided, abused, and abandoned.
With the threat of revolution sweeping Europe and the Americas, and with German George on the throne, the historians were directed to play down any nationalistic feelings and emphasise our Anglo-Saxon past. The Arthur legend had to go.
History is the most important of all political weapons. Have no doubt about it. May not be so instant like a war or like a dropping of a bomb, but it is the most potent of all political weapons. And so they decided they would introduce a history that was suitable to the church, which was suitable to the state. And so they suddenly you found Bishop Stubbs was appointed Professor of History in Oxford University, a convinced fundamental Christian. Noah's Ark, sons of Noah, populate the entire world. His grandsons, everybody is descended from Noah. In Cambridge, a man named Edwin Guest, a fanatical fundamental Christian, same old as Stubbs, is appointed Professor of History. Didn't even apply for the job. And so you had these two fanatics busy reconstructing and rewriting British history in a suitable biblical manner to suit the church, to suit the support of the royal family. And so everything that didn't suit that political necessity, that was not politically correct, had to go. King Arthur had to go, both of them. Of course, they would have got away with this. I think they would have got away with it if it hadn't been for King Arthur. I mean, both King Arthurs. But if it had not been for the Arthur legend, they would have got away with it. But he stood there too big and too powerful, too well placed in the people's mind, imagination, a linchpin, a cornerstone. They couldn't get rid of him.
Growing up in South Wales, Alan was familiar with the local stories of Arthur and his knights. With the brutes of England confirming Arthur as a Glamorgan king, it was logical for him and Baram to return to Wales. With a nation and history unchanged for 2,000 years, the memory of Arthur lives on in its songs and poems, its parchment and stone, and in the very landscape itself. In a Nevern churchyard is the stone of a king called Hal Dar, or Hal the Good. Around 920 AD, a king list was drawn up for the wedding of his son, Prince Owen. This document, called the Harleian 3859, still survives today in the British Museum. It contains the names of both Arthurs.
383, the armies of the British invaded Gaul. And the general of Magnus's armies was his son Arthur. The Latins called him Andragathius. And he defeated Gratian, the Emperor of Rome. He defeated Gratian in battle at Soissons, which they called the Battle of Sassy in Geoffrey of Monmouth, chased him to Lyons, Lugdunum, invited him to a meal and executed him.
With an Arthur remembered for fighting the Romans, was there evidence of a later Arthur? Incredibly, in King List 28 there is mention of a Glamorgan king called Arthuris or Arthmau, a 6th generation descendant of Arthur I.
You get a line of princes. You get a son of Arthur I, Tathal, then Tithrin the Subtle, Tithfalt or Theodosius, Tudric, Theodoric, Myrig, Maurice, and then Myrig's son, Arthur II. And so you've got two Arthurs very clearly exhibited. These are not hidden. You'll find them clearly in the manuscript evidences that everybody else uses when they're writing about British history. So they're harder to miss than they are to find.
Further research confirmed their findings.
There's a group of manuscripts known as the Blackett manuscripts. Again, these are always quoted by diligent people looking for art. And in the Blackett manuscripts, I think it's the Harleian 4181. And again, I think it's the British Museum Vespasian A14. Again, you've got lists of the parentage and so on, ancestry of Brecon of Brecon. His mother was Marshall, who is a sister of King Myrig, so which makes Arthur and Brecon to be first cousins. And then it goes back, King Tudric, King Tithfalt, Theodosius, all the way back to Arthur I and Magnus Maximus.
Their search now took them to Cardiff and to the site of one of the oldest cathedrals in the country. With a mixture of the old and new, its windows clearly demonstrate its links with King Arthur of Glamorgan. Its ancient charters, republished by Allen and Baram in their book called The Charter of the Kings, established without doubt the dynasty of the Glamorgan kings. But what did these charters tell them?
They list the kings and they list the king's family, his brothers, his sons and some of his daughters and cousins and nephews and so on. Because these people are the nobility and they attend important land granting ceremonies with the church. On the church side you get the bishop, usually the three local abbots and their senior clergy. But what is happening, as the charters go on down the centuries, a king dies and the bishop serves the next king, or the bishop dies and another one comes in, and they overlap each other. And so you can get a clear picture of who was who by linking them together in this overlapping fashion down the centuries. And you also see the sons coming in as witnesses and later becoming kings themselves and so on, witnessing these charters. And so it's possible to create a pretty extensive who was who for the entire period, around 400 to 1100.
Many of the land grants date from the 6th century, at a time when a King Myrig was rebuilding the cathedral. One of the grants concerned land at a place called Llangeni. Be it known to us that Myrig, son of Tudric, king of Glamorgan, and his wife Ombraust, daughter of Gorgon the Great, have given to God and Adasius the bishop 54 acres of land at Llangeni. Amongst the witnesses are his sons Arthurus and Idneth. That Arthurus followed his father Myrig as king is evidence from another grant. Be it known to the clergy and people of southern Britain that Arthurus, king of the region of Gwent, granted to God and to St Duffrig and St Tylo, and in the hand of Bishop Comrig the Church of Sinvark.
Now from this one charter alone, and there are others, it's patently obvious that Arthur succeeded King Myrig as king.
From these and other charters, Arthur's family tree can be established. King Tudric, Arthur's grandfather, married Gawain. They are followed by his son Myrig and his queen Ombraust. Amongst their children is Arthurus or Arthur and his brothers and sister Anna.
These charters and the lists of kings which can be extracted can then be compared with lives of the saints. All the saints were royal and noble people. You couldn't be a saint unless you were royal, you see. And obviously saints had mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and so on, and saints also married. They didn't believe in celibacy like the Roman Church. And so you have the lives of the saints give you further linked genealogies which link in with the land of charters.
One such saint is Tylo, who was a son of Marshall and a cousin of Arthur. His tomb is in Llandaff as is St Duffrig's, the bishop who crowned Arthur. Though many have tried to dismiss these charters, these tombs are just one small piece of the jigsaw that demonstrate that these people were real.
What we are confronted with is a vast, accurate, precise, detailed history, provable in almost every way, totally authentic, and it's cast aside because of a totally unfounded, almost lunatic set of allegations which have gone unchallenged. And it's got to the incredible stage where people run around saying, oh, it's all forged, it's all forged. They don't know one single thing, or one fact, or one iota of how or why or in what way it's forged. They have no proof, no evidence, and there is no evidence, and yet they all accept this foul allegation.
From these genealogies, it's possible to place Arthur into the 6th century.
One prominent means of dating is Arthur had a sister named Anna, and Anna had a son named Saint Samson. Samson of Dol, as he was known, actually moved over to Brittany. Dol is over there. He attended and signed the papers of the Second Council of Paris in 556. So if Samson is signing the papers as a fairly young cleric, actually, in 556, King Arthur is his uncle, his mother's brother, has got to be of the same era.
They knew from the charters the story of King Tudric, who, after a vision from an angel, had died defending his country. But was there any evidence he really existed?
We're here in the Wye Valley at Tintern, and the reason we're here is that there was a ford in the River Wye here. Now, we believe this is roughly the spot of the ford, and a battle was fought here 1500 odd years ago in the year 508 AD. The senior king, Theodoric or Tudric, had retired. It was a common custom to retire and prepare yourself for heaven. His son Maurice had taken over the rule. The Saxons made a raid into Wales. Having made the raid, you have to get away with the booty. Theodoric was living here at Tintern, which means Dindairn, the stones of the monarch. And he gathered what men he could in a small army, and he barricaded the ford to prevent the Saxons getting out, while his son Maurice was coming up with the army to catch him before they could get out. And so there was quite a fight here at the ford. And somebody struck Theodoric on the head. After the battle, they put Theodoric onto a cart drawn by 2 deer, and they were taking him down river, and he wanted to be buried on the island of Echny, which is the flat home in Cardiff Bay.
After 3 days' travelling, they reached a meadow near the River Severn, where a spring flowed. Today it is called Mathen, meaning the martyred monarch. It was here that, according to several historical accounts, he died. A plaque still marks the spring, and nearby a church named after him contains his grave.
In 1618, they carried out an excavation of the grave, and they found a stone sarcophagus. That's not made for ordinary people. In it, a skeleton, and the skeleton displayed a very large, serious head wound to the skull. This matches with the story of Tudric being smashed on the head, taking 3 days to die. In 1881, they again excavated the grave of Tudric, again opened the coffin, and the later generation were able to see the skeleton again with the wound in the skull. So the person of the king is quite apparently there, is apparent to any reasonable man, in his stone coffin at Mathen. Tudric had a wife, St. Gawain, and St. Gawain's chapel is a little chapel down a little dingle, you don't know, go down a cliff path, and it's right overlooking the sea, tiny little chapel. Now they excavated that in 15 years ago, and under the altar they found a small female skeleton. Now it's St. Gawain's chapel, named for Gawain, the wife of King Tudric, And there is a small female star. And in the press it said the researchers did not dare to think it might be St. Carmine. Why does not? If they dig up somebody in Egypt, they don't say, we don't dare to think this is an ancient Egyptian. And so, where this sort of thing has been possible, and there are other instances, they turn out to be true and factual.
These genealogies and stories were common knowledge to the people of South Wales. Hundreds of books published between 1750 and 1900 confirmed Arthur as a king of Glamorgan. Up until 1924, these facts were taught in the classrooms of Wales. But what other evidence was there? Allen and Baram had noted that according to the histories, almost all the Welsh kings and nobility had memorial stones. As their research progressed, they discovered many of them still in the Welsh landscape.
Then we've got about 200 ancient inscribed stones in Wales, and again, kings are named and often giving land grants to noble relatives who are in the church. And other matters go on these stones. An inscribed stone is a contemporary document, and to say there is no contemporary document in ancient Britain is false, because we know next to nothing about ancient Assyria and Egypt and elsewhere. We didn't have writings on stone and on baked clay tablets. So not to take the stones into consideration is ludicrous.
Legend has it that Joseph of Arimathea himself founded the church at Llantwit Major, and so it's not surprising that at such an important and holy site, royal stones have been found.
Now in this church is a stone of King Ethael. Ethael was a brother of Morgan, and jointly Morgan and Ethael succeeded Arthur II. The stone of Ethael also names Illtyd, the first cousin of Arthur, and it also names on the bottom Arthmael. Arthmael, Iron Bear, is the normal calling of Arthur II. There are two other stones here. One is St. Samson. St. Samson is the son of Anna. Anna was a daughter of King Moerig, therefore Samson is a nephew of King Arthur, because Anna and Arthur are brother and sister. And another stone names a King Howell and his son King Rhys, and that is probably of the 7th century, around 750. Again, descendants of Morgan and Ethael. So you've got descendants of Arthur here, and you've got Arthur named on a stone, and that's quite significant.
But the stones at Llantwit Major were not the only evidence of Arthur and his family in South Wales. Amongst the ruins of Ogmore Castle on the Urenny River, they made another remarkable discovery.
We've come here because a stone was found in this castle. It's an ancient 6th century stone, and there are 4 names upon it. It says how King Arthmael, Iron Bear, who was Arthur II, is granting land to 3 people for religious purposes, presumably. One is Nertat. Nertat is a daughter of Brucken of Brecon, who's Arthur's first cousin. Another is Philly the Bishop, who is Ufelwyn, a bishop of Llandaff. And another one is Glwys, who is either Glwys Cernew, a father of King Gwyntlw, and Arthur arranged Gwyntlw's marriage to a daughter of Brucken, or alternatively, he's Glwys, a brother of St. Cadwch, and a son of Gwyntlw. Either way, all the characters on the stone are all genuine, historical 6th century characters. They all fit.
Other relatives, such as his brother Paul and his uncle Cynfelion, a brother of King Tudric, also have stones. Here at the Marga Museum is the Bodvik stone, probably named after King Budic, an ally of Arthur's grandfather. Again, we have a real historical figure named on a stone. There are many other stones that provide a link between the histories and the kings of Glamorgan, but the sad fact is they are largely ignored or have been deliberately destroyed.
A major problem is the actual dating of the ancient Welsh memorial stones of the kings and the princes. The problem arises from an unlikely source, a man who was not a historian, not an archaeologist. His name is Collingwood, W.G. Collingwood, from up in the northeast of England. I believe Yorkshire, maybe Northumberland. And he came up with a theory that the carving of ancient stone crosses and stones began in England. And it began in the north of England. science of carving stones spread from the north of England and was taken to Ireland, and they taught the Irish how to do it. And the Irish in turn came over to the ignorant peasant Welsh and taught them how to carve stones. Now, the summation of this is that all Irish stones which he carved would be after 650 or probably after 700 AD. And all Welsh carved ancient stones would be later again and assisted by the Irish. This is a problem. So the stone of King Teichwald is redated and renamed. And the stone of King Tudric, Theodoric, is redated and renamed. And where there is a mixture of ancient Colburn alphabet and Welsh Colburn alphabet and Latin letters, they say, oh no, that's not Welsh Colburn. That is an ancient Irish letter. An Irish alphabet that was only invented about 1700. You've got this horrible mixture. They're now redating the stones. Well, if you redate the stones, you're moving them away from their true period. And so you've got a stone, say, dated 900, naming people, and nobody of that name can be traced in that era. And so a huge mess has been created because Mr. Collingwood from the northeast of England had no clue whatsoever of the ancient history of Britain and no clue of ancient British Welsh history or Irish history. But he had a lovely little theory that suited the establishment mind. And it suited the establishment brand new fabricated Orwellian history. But all these kings left stones. But you get rid of them by redating them for 500-600 years.
One thing that could not be destroyed was the remains of a huge land reclamation scheme mentioned in the life of St Genovasius. Working alongside 2,400 other monks, and under the supervision of Arthur's cousin St Illtyd, they constructed a network of dykes stretching between Cardiff and Chepstow.
The reason for the dykes is that all the land behind them is well below sea level. So it was a huge land reclamation exercise, and masses of canals, like a checkerboard or chessboard system, cross and crisscross this landscape, draining it. This remarkable construction is post-Roman and pre-Norman. The interesting thing is that the life of Genovasius says Genovasius is working on the dykes in the land of Arthur. So the land of Arthur is South East Wales.
If King Arthur was a Glamorgan king, where was his Camelot? Though today there may not be much to see, there was once a castle standing on this site. A wedding was recorded as taking place here as late as 1453. It was called the Yellow Fortress, or Caer Melin. Could this be Camelot?
It may have got its name from the nearby sulphur springs of Yellow Wells Farm. There's a number of houses in the area, the grey house, the brown house, the blue house, the ancient manor houses. And Yellow Wells Farm is just below. This place is Caer, a castle. Melin is yellow. So Caer Melin can easily be seen to be perhaps translated into some Norman French as Camelot or Camelot. It's quite possible. The whole point is it's also known as Cibor. And Cibor, C-U, means mutually together, and Burd means table. So Cibord means mutually together table. That's evocative in the Arthurian sense. The other thing is that the city or town of Cardiff was in the parliamentary hundred of Cibor. Cibord was not in the parliamentary hundred of Cardiff. It's the other way around. And so until very recent times, this ancient field and castle was the most important place in this entire area. There's no doubt about that. And there's no doubt it was the ancient residence of the Glamorgan kings.
Another royal court can be found on the Glamorgan coast at Dunraven, or Dindruffin as it is called in Welsh. Protected by the sea on three sides, it would have been relatively easy to defend, and therefore the ideal location for a summer residence. Its ancient banks and ditches can still be seen today, and it was here, according to legend, Arthur was born. The histories also tell of Sir Bedivere, one of Arthur's generals, being buried on its slopes. Close to the cliff edge is what appears to be a large funeral mound.
In the car park by the buildings there was a very large sign on two posts holding it up like that. And this sign actually contained a genealogy of the Glamorgan kings from King Caraddoc down the year time of Christ, down to Iestyn ap Gurgan, Justin son of Aurelian, in 1091. The Glamorgan kings and their families all displayed. When we started publishing and printing and announcing what we were doing in 1982, this was still there. It was still there for a year or two afterwards. Then we were going to publish again in 1986. That's where it wrecks. And they took the sign down. Now, why did they take this display of the Glamorgan kings down from a Glamorgan ancient royal site and remove it completely? To me, it's very suspicious, because it smacks of conspiracy, because that's what it is, conspiracy.
Today at the Visitors Centre, a genealogy chart does list the kings, including Tudric and Myric. Strangely, Arthur's name, the most famous of all, is omitted, and the list skips a generation to his son Morgan. Yet again, another link in the chain has been broken.
If you buy a map before 1982, you'll see Monument and Millware, built by Theodosius Tithfalt, commemorate the dead of the Great Massacre, around 456. It's on the maps. But it's not on the maps after 1982-83. They've taken it off the maps. A war had erupted between Saxons employed by Vortigern, Gwythaeron, and the British. The Saxons were defeated and they asked for a peace conference. Both sides were to come unarmed to the peace conference, and this would, guarantee safety. Unfortunately, the Saxons had other ideas and they brought concealed weapons with them. Too much beer was drunk at this seemingly successful peace conference, and at a given signal by Hengist, the one-eyed Saxon leader, they drew their short sixes or Saxon swords or knives, and each one killed the British person sitting next to him. The result was 363 of the leaders of the British military and government were killed, murdered. Another war erupted, and the leader of the British this time was Tithfalt, Theodosius, the father of Tudric, Theodric. He defeated the Saxons, killed Hengist, executed him, and then he gathered the 363 bodies of the British leaders who were killed in the massacre, and he brought them here to this place, which is called Monument and Millware, grave monument of the soldiers. It's a circular monument, recorded as such, and he buried them in Monument and Millware. As we try to exhibit the history, they take it off the maps.
One of Arthur's most famous battles is the Battle of Baden. It was here that he won a decisive victory over the Saxons, and relative peace was restored to the country for over half a century. Scholars have for years argued to its location, but by putting Arthur into Wales, it becomes childishly easy to find.
When we set out originally on this journey to find the Arthurs, I remember early discussions with my colleague, and I said, how do we locate the various places that we have to locate? This is a matter of, ancient geography and ancient topography. And he said, we'll buy some maps. And I said, we'll buy maps. He said, yeah, we'll buy some maps. And it has been that easy. If we take the Ordnance Survey map produced by the government on our behalf, and we look at it, we find something very strange. In the Maesteg Valley, we find Myned Baden. Now that's very strange, because nobody can find Myned Baden. It's said to be close to the banks of the Severn. It is. Here's the banks of the Severn. The road to it is for the Gyfraith, road to the Tumult. The army gathering grounds are known down here, we can prove it. Around it are all manner of names. The name of the battlefield is Maes Cad, Lower. Now, Mice is field, Cad is battle, and Lower is area. Field of battle area. On the top of the hill, there are rows of the ancient trenches they would dig if they got to the battlefield first. And they'd dig a trench out, mound the earth up behind it, and they'd stand on top of the mound. So the enemy would have a ditch to get across and get up at them. There are also vast grave mounds there. Now, after any big battle, you've got a lot of dead people. And so whenever there's been battle in ancient times, you find one or two, usually two, huge grave mounds for the dead, both sides, and smaller grave mounds for the illustrious people, the princes who might have been killed. And they're there. Everything around the place is right. Kinwyd Kinwydion, one of Arthur's knights, the church of Llangudwyd. Llangynwyd, Llan, and Kinwyd becomes Llangynwyd.
Another fallen knight, Luarchen, is remembered in a place name, Brunluarch, just a short distance from the battlefield area.
Gadley's battle court, there's always a battle court after a battle, somewhere where they probably went and settled down for the night. The Dell of Chastisement is there, and so on. Everything bespeaks battle, and the name is correct. In all the Welsh records it says Mynydd Baden, and if you look for Mynydd Baden, there it is, smack on target. And there's masses of supporting evidence, even the route which the Saxons took to get there. By name places names. And so finding the map of Baden is, well, in this day and age of computers where you press Mynydd Baden in the computer and the OS maps, it'll come up instantly for you. It's ludicrous.
Other battle sites like Camlan and Longborth can just as easily be found. The histories tell of Geraint, one of Arthur's knights, being mortally wounded at the battle. Just a few miles away is Bed Geraint Farm, meaning grave of Geraint, and in an isolated field is his grave mound.
So it doesn't matter what you find, and it doesn't matter how often you find it, and it doesn't matter if you prove things right 10,000 times, this history is wrong. Now that is a very strange attitude, and we've never been able to get to grips with it.
Ancient Wales was a great repository of original British history. Its annals tell us that Christianity was brought to these shores by the disciples of Jesus as early as AD 35. And as the struggle for religious supremacy raged, Roman Catholicism tried to wipe out apostolic truths and all references to it.
So what the British believe, or believed, is not what the Roman Church preaches. And so you have a very serious religious confrontation here. And the best way to get rid of it is to simply call all the British records either non-existent or forged or fabricated or irrelevant, and then your version prevails. It's politics, and it's dirty politics. It's got nothing to do with right and wrong, nothing to do with facts. It's nothing to do with evidence or proof. It's got everything to do with politics. There are instances of Welsh libraries being burned by arson. In other words, we want to get rid of them. So there was a tendency for Welsh to keep the manuscripts and to hold them tightly and not even admit to having them. There's stories of when Welsh princes were captured, they were taken to London, and often their libraries were taken with them to the Tower of London. And a monk named Scholasticus earned infamy rather than fame by burning all the records that had been Welsh records that had been accumulated in the tower. He burned them. Obviously he didn't like what was in them. And it wasn't until about 1800 that the problem finally erupted that, some English scholars were saying, well, I don't think there are any Welsh manuscripts. Well, of course there were, but they weren't showing them, you see.
But the suppression of the ancient histories was not limited to the destruction of old manuscripts and libraries.
Caxton started printing in England, in London, in 1474. And the English Parliament immediately passed a law prohibiting printing in Wales. And you weren't allowed to print anything in Wales till 1692, 200 years later. And by then the damage was done. Ideas had been set in stone. Several times English kings and parliaments passed laws prohibiting the use of writing materials in Wales. I don't know if you know that. It was against the law to actually own a pen or a piece of paper. The education system was controlled by London. London in 1846 replaced every Welsh-speaking school teacher in Wales with an Englishman who couldn't speak Welsh. They did. They imported them by the hundred. They sacked every Welsh school teacher. So you had a monoglot population speaking Welsh, with about 10% of them being bilingual, speaking English. And you had every school teacher who spoke only English. I mean, the situation in the classrooms must have been absolutely diabolical.
The clash between the British and Roman Church has resulted in many early dates being misplaced.
In the early stages of the Proofs of England, they only ever give one date, and the date is the death of Arthur. And they don't give a date in sense. They say it's 546 years after the incarnation of the Lord. You've got a problem. Was Jesus the Nazarene a man on earth and simply a man, a prophet, when he died? Was he a man on earth and he became a huge spiritual God when he died? Or was he a spiritual God on earth and also a God when he gets to heaven? This was a debate that's racked the church, and they went in ever-decreasing circles on it for a long time. They finally decided he was a god and a god and a god, you know. But of course the British were not Roman Catholics. They were Gnostic, Apostolic Christians. And they knew all about Jesus Christ, or Jesus the Nazarene. And so for them, the incarnation took place at his crucifixion. So if he was crucified in the year 33, 546 years after the crucifixion becomes 579. And that date for the death of Arthur fits with all sorts of historical events and other recordings. Maelgwn is elected king in the north after the death of Arthur. Arthur dies 579, Maelgwn is king 580. And numerous other datings all go together. They combine very nicely to establish this 579 death date.
It was now time for Alan and Baram to go in search of the grave of Arthur. They knew that there was a tradition of him and his queen being buried at Glastonbury in Somerset. But that, as they quickly discovered, was unlikely.
Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset was founded by an English king in 941, and the first abbot was St Dunstan in 942. Now, if Arthur II dies in 579, then we're at least 450 years too late with Glastonbury in Somerset. As another factor, Arthur is said to be buried in the great and ancient graveyard where multitudes of the great and illustrious of the British are buried. There is no great ancient graveyard at Glastonbury.
It was while they were researching Arthur I that they discovered that the original Glastonbury, or Glasdennan as it was called, is near Lichfield in the Midlands. In an ancient king list it states a King Mormal and his people of Glaston came from a place called Loicot. Translated from the Latin, Loicot was an ancient Roman-British town, now a village called Wall.
If you want to trace Arthur I, you look at William of Malmesbury and others, and they tell how he fortified the Lichfield area, and there are evidences of great fortifications in the general area. Arthur is said to be buried in the great ancient churchyard where multitudes of the illustrious of the British are buried. So you're looking for a great ancient churchyard with whacking big graves in it. Lots of them. And there is such a place where huge mounds and monumental tombs exist in large numbers. There's a place called Old Bury, the old burying place. And it's at Atherstone, Arthur's Twin, Arthur's grave mound in Warwickshire. And that's where you're going to find King Arthur, as mentioned by the medieval historians.
After many visits to the cemetery, they eventually made a remarkable discovery. Just a few inches below the surface, they struck a large stone.
There are letters on it. It appears to say something, but it means you have to sort of finish the words off. But it was the same as one of our other things. You know, what do we do with this? Because they're never going to believe it anyway. There's something that's grown up in Britain, and it's peculiar to America as well. If an academic or an archaeologist finds something, it's genuine. If someone who's not an archaeologist finds something, then it's not genuine.
The preserved words on the stone are in Latin. The first word is nearly complete, Artorius, or Arthur. Iset means cast down, and Masai could be part of his father's name, Maximus. If this was the original Glastonbury, why was there an Arthur tradition in Somerset?
It appears that Henry II had something to do with this promotion of the idea of Arthur in Somerset. Henry II, in order to be king of Britain as such, wanted justification. Now, if he could claim to be the heir, if only by sort of linked royal succession of some sort, or the fact that he was a king of England, if he could prove that Arthur was a king of England, and he was then a later king of England, if Arthur ruled the whole of Britain, then so Henry II was entitled to rule the whole of Britain. Justification. And so it looks as if he prompted his cousin, the abbot, to dig up Arthur at Glastonbury, and that would provide Arthur being out of Wales, away from Wales, and into England. Arthur's an ancient English-British king, and therefore Henry II is entitled to rule Wales, Scotland, and England. Very simple. It ignores the fact that Walter Map and Gruffydd ap Arthur, Geoffrey of Monmouth, and others really promoted the Arthurian story and brought it bursting forth from southeast Wales and not from Somerset.
On their quest to discover the truth behind the Arthurian legend, Allen and Baram had made significant discoveries. The histories and folklore so ridiculed by other researchers was pointing to there being two Arthurs, who in time had been assembled into one mighty legend. Not only did they discover the real Glastonbury and the burial place of Arthur I, but they discovered overwhelming evidence that the second Arthur was a king of Glamorgan, living in the 6th century. The Roman Church had done its best to destroy these histories and the memories of the early Christians, but for those willing to look, the truth was there. In part 2 of the Arthurian conspiracy, Allen and Baram not only cracked the code to the secret burial of King Arthur of Glamorgan, but they also learned the incredible story of how a nuclear winter devastated Britain during his reign. Finally, the clues would take them on a journey made over 1500 years ago, which can only now be fully understood through the use of modern DNA techniques. It's a journey that will shatter our perceptions of our so-called Dark Age.